Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to CSIS. Today's panel is beyond 5G standards for 6th generation networks. And I know what some of you are saying, 6G already? We haven't even gotten through 5G. The correct answer is it's already here in some ways, and that the transition will be faster than previous generations of telecom, and the lines may not be as distinct between 5G and 6G. We know that standards from our 5G experience are central to this. You have standards which reflect work on patents, which reflect work on R&Ds. So we're already well into that chain when it comes to the next generation. We're lucky today to have a very strong panel. It's going to be moderated by Rob Strayer, who most of you know from his time at State, and he's now the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Information Technology and Industry Council. Rob, over to you.
Great, thanks, Jim. When we started thinking more about what 5G would evolve into beyond 5G and incrementally to 6G, we thought of no better partner than working with you and CSIS on this. You were one of the first trendsetters in this area to really thinking about 5G policy. And today we're going to have an excellent panel of industry experts who are going to unpack some of the reasons why industry is already looking at how we're going to build into 6G standards and why it's the most relevant subject matter areas to be thinking about as we look at what will become beyond 5G and 6G. So I'd like to start by introducing our panel. First, we have Micaela Giuhat, who's the Director of 5G Policy and External Engagements at Microsoft. Next, we have Travis Russell, who is the Director of Cybersecurity at Oracle Communications. And third, we have John Smee, who is Vice President of Engineering at Qualcomm Technologies. I also point out that these are all three experts who are at companies who are also ITI members. We represent approximately 80 of the most innovative tech companies in the world. Just as an opening round of questions and opening remarks and opening thoughts, I'd like each of our panelists to opine on why standards have been so important in the past for the development of telecommunications technology and the important role that they play in the R&D cycle all the way through to commercial deployments for 5G, and as we look forward into the incremental progress to 6G. So with that, I'd like to invite Travis to go first.
Thanks, Rob. So let me start by explaining a little bit about how this whole process works and who gets involved. So the ITU actually defines the requirements. So in the case of 5G, that was published in IMT 2020. They then go to the 3GPP, which defines the architecture and the specifications for either meeting or exceeding the requirements that ITU puts out. It's important to understand that 3GPP was formed to solve an earlier problem that we had in the standards. Before, we were looking at 7 different regions, and each one of those regions had their own set of standards. So as a supplier, you had to build to all of these different variations of standards from these different countries. And so the spirit behind 3GPP was to bring all of those standards bodies together into one global cohesive organization, and that is the 3GPP. So it's comprised of 7 partner standards organizations representing North America, which is ATIS, Japan, which is Arab, Korea, which is the TTA, China, which is CCSA, Europe, which is ETSI, India, which is TSDSI, and of course Taiwan, which is TTC. And no, I don't have those memorized. I had to write those down. So, and it's also important to know that 3GPP is not the only standards body that's working on this stuff. There's technology that's being used in this new architecture that's coming from the IETF, that's coming from ONF, and a number of other organizations that define standards, not just for telecom, but a lot now from IT and cloud. And you'll note that the 3GPP scope, it's very limited to just what is the architecture and the security that is needed to meet the requirements set forth by the ITU. The rest of the stuff, like the technology around virtualization, comes from other standards bodies. That's outside the scope of 3GPP. They also do not talk about implementation. So you'll see there's a lot of optional requirements that 3GPP defines because it really is implementation specific. So there's other organizations like the GSMA, for example. They actually develop standards on how do you implement the standards that come out of the 3GPP. So collaboration between all of these standards bodies globally is absolutely critical to the advancement of our technology. We don't want to go backwards. We don't want to go back to 7 different regions doing 7 different things. We've come a long ways in getting to a global standard, and it's working quite well, actually. The other thing to understand is that 3GPP works in releases. So 5G started with release 15. We're now finishing the work on release 16. I think it's supposed to be done at the end of the year. Release 17 work then is just in the wings. Each release is iterative. It's work that evolves from one release to another. And that's important to understand when we look at who participates in standards. It doesn't do any good for somebody to come in, spend a year in standards, and then move on, because this work starts from previous releases and then goes forward into future releases. So you'll find that the people who work in this, we've been doing this for a long, long time. And we continue our as a part of our career as a standards involvement. And that's really, really important because you need that expertise as you evolve the technology going forward. Release 15 was labeled as 5G, and it's really up to 3GPP to define what's going to be 6G, 7G. And in fact, if you look at release 18, which is a few years away, it looks like that's going to be labeled as 5G advanced. And we saw this back with LTE, right? We had LTE advanced, or what I affectionately refer to as 3.5G, 3 3/4 G, 4G, 4.5G. I guess now we're going to have 5.5G, maybe 5 3/4 G. You'll see that as we round the corner around release 18. I haven't seen anything announced as far as what release is dedicated to 6G yet. 5G, though, it's a complete departure from anything that we have done in our industry before, because we have moved away from any technology that's specific or proprietary to telecom. You should know that we began this transition in telecom to IP-based networks back in 4G, a little bit in 5G. We did bring in IP technology in parts of the 3G network. We expanded that in 4G. And then in 5G, we threw the baby out with the bathwater, started all over again, redefined the architecture to align with what we do in IT networks, built on cloud technology, and used a lot of existing cloud and IT technology rather than some of these proprietary protocols like SS7 or diameter, et cetera. So we moved from a hub and spoke model to a model that uses microservices in what's called a service bus architecture. And now we're using technology like HTTP and JSON for the control part of the network. So the entire network has evolved from an appliance-based network to a software-based network that's based on this collaboration of standards bodies across the ecosystem. The last frontier that we have not yet virtualized is the RAN, and that's why you see so much work being done around an open RAN, where it's all softwareized, it's virtualized, disaggregated from the hardware. We've been working on this form of virtualization within the network, like I said, since 3G. So this is the last part of the network that we need to virtualize and convert into software. As far as 6G and 7G and all of the future Gs, as Jim alluded, we're going to start seeing these come much faster than we have in previous releases because we've moved to a software model. We don't have to define hardware anymore. We don't have to define proprietary protocols anymore. It's merely a matter of what functionality do these network functions need to be able to support. And so to put it into contrast, when we introduced SS7, which was the standard for fixed line all the way up to 2G and 3G, it took about 25 years to get from standards to deployment. We shortened that in 4G. It took about 10 years. The goal here now with 6G and beyond, it could be 3 to 5 years. And we're introducing a new G. So these releases are going to come a lot faster. And government and industry really need to be prepared for that level of acceleration. So back to you, Rob.
Right. That's a great overview. Thanks a lot, Travis. John, I'd like to turn to you next. I mean, Qualcomm Technologies is a leading company in the innovation of, if you will, wireless interfaces that are in our smartphones and a number of other areas. So coming from the engineering perspective, could you add a little bit more to why it's important to have standards and what role they played in the thinking, the business side thinking of a company like Qualcomm?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, great to follow Travis here. And thanks a lot, Rob, for that introduction. So yeah, when we look at it, what's kind of exciting, as alluded, the transition to 5G has been faster. The number of 5G devices is growing so quickly. Literally, 1 billion plus 5G connections are expected by 2023. And it's this kind of growing amount. It's happening faster than 4G. So the number of connected devices and the types of connected devices. So there's a reason that 5G is moving forward in this evolution. So as we said, release 15 set that foundation. New mobile broadband designs. So not only is that connecting smartphones, also connecting homes with fixed wireless access, and even designs for new frequency bands like millimeter wave. So I'm holding here in my hand a 28 gigahertz, cell phone, and it's amazing that here in these devices now we have 28 gigahertz, we have 39 gigahertz, we have all these different LTE bands, we have 4G and 5G working together. And so the point of the technology side, we have these Gs coming approximately every decade. And that's really a huge amount of NRE and R&D that goes into that. So that innovation is about how do you creatively put together this wealth of opportunity. And one of the relevant things for 5G is the role of cloud computing, the role of edge computing. And so not only can we move gigabits per second around, given the bands like millimeter wave and the 5G connectivity, we're also then bringing 5G into these new deployment models. So we look at kind of the services side, the spectrum side, and the deployment topology side. And so on the spectrum side, as we mentioned, including bands like millimeter wave, sub-6, and even for long-term research into 6G, we're looking at even higher frequency bands, in addition to also how would we redesign an overall air interface for 2030 deployments. And so then if we look at, well, what's happening in the deployment side, these networks are really becoming more disaggregated. So the way you put together compute and connectivity, radio units and distributed units. So to get the scale of these horizontal models, you're bringing together a lot of technology innovation and putting it together in creative ways where you're trying to lower that cost per bit so that these deployments can serve these new use cases. And I think a good example of that in the 5G context is we made sure we were designing for some of these industrial applications, things like high reliability, low latency communication. So stuff that used to go on wires, like in an industrial Ethernet. Well, in 5G, as part of release 16, we made sure we brought in that time-sensitive networking, that guaranteed delivery of ultra-reliable, low-latency communication. And that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of interest in deploying 5G private network for industrial applications, or bringing 5G into connected vehicles, or even as we look at evolving the hospital of the future. If we look at the classroom of the future, all of these technologies are intersecting with that 5G toolbox because of its capabilities. And you're getting that commercial global scale because of standardization. So the reason you can be using your phone in Chicago, San Diego, New York, or Europe, or Korea, Japan, China, or anywhere in the world is because of that global standard. So it enables companies to export. It also enables a robust ecosystem, getting cost-effective devices into more people's hands, into more use cases. So if we look foundationally at driving interesting new ideas, as mentioned, release 18, which is going to start next year, that's the beginning of 5G advanced. So we can view 5G even in the first half, release 15, 16, 17, that second half, release 18, 19, 20. So we have a full decade of 5G innovation ahead of us as we look at the full 2020s. And at the same time, those foundational research vectors, whether it's applying machine learning and artificial intelligence, or looking at new forms of full duplex and higher frequency bands of metamaterials, all of that research, coupled with new approaches for resiliency, those are coming together to have 6G standardization towards the latter half of the decade. So we look at standardization, say 2027, 2028, you might think of release 21 as being 6G. And so that's going to enable 6G deployments around 2030 timeframe. And so that decade pacing is really important because a lot of industry academic collaboration is happening now. It's the time for foundational deep 6G research. It's also the time to be thinking creatively, well, how can I further evolve 5G? How can I get the most value of those investments that have been made? And so that's one of the exciting challenges, is leveraging and evolving from that 5G foundation over the next 5 years. And at the same time, putting together those ideas in more foundational ways to build a new 6G air interface. So in my view, it's kind of an exciting time at this 5G, 6G transition, where on the research side, we're feeding both 5G evolution and long-term 6G. And at the same time, there's a huge amount of product expansion in the 5G space, and that's going to absolutely continue for the remainder of the decade.
Great. Thanks for that, spelling out that broader timeline. I mean, it's really important to have in mind is, that's part of the reason why we're talking about 6G today, thinking about the end of decade and working back from there. Micaela, before you were at Microsoft, you had a deep background in wireless telecommunications with other companies. And so Microsoft is one of those players that's seeking to insert information technology and cloud computing that Travis mentioned a few minutes ago into which got inserted into 5G and will be a role in future generations of wireless communications. I was wondering if you could talk about that, and also the ADIS organization, their Next G Alliance project, where you're the chair of the policy committee. So please take it from there.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for having me, and honored to be on this panel. As a third speaker, it's always hard because everything sort of it's usually been said by the two speakers before, which were wonderful. But yes, I will try to address. First of all, I think the mention of cloud technology is very important, because really it's not that Microsoft wants to insert themselves. It's more the fact that the cloud and 5G technologies are really interdependent. As Travis mentioned, the 5G architecture is actually done in such a way that takes full advantage of the cloud efficiencies and cloud compute and the disaggregated nature of functionality, and again, the additional applications, if you wish, that cloud enable from an ecosystem perspective. Having said that, it's very interesting that coming from a telecommunication background, it is clearly there are clearly two drivers, if you wish, that are not necessarily aligned all the time, but they are coming together, I would say, in a very nicely way. So you have, from a telecommunications perspective, you have the standards organizations, which are clearly extremely important, right? So all aspects of 5G technologies, networks, and services are really based on a comprehensive framework of standards derived through a work of experts in a myriad of standard setting bodies, really, and working groups, as it has been mentioned before, along very long time frames and timelines. So standards are an extremely important vehicle for international harmonization on technology, but also business and policy. And in order to really promote participation in 5G and next Gs, all governments and all commercial institutions should actively participate and contribute to the relevant standard bodies and prioritize incorporating this technology. Now, these are the standard bodies. From an IT perspective and a cloud perspective, you have usually the desire, for things like open source, which are now really part and parcel of any solution in a telecom application, right? So you have this very open and very fast moving pace of the IT industry coming together with the standard, telephony or telecommunication mentality, if you wish. But all in all, as I said, they're coming together and they will really improve the timelines, as again, Travis mentioned, of instead of going from 25 years to 10, now we are going to 8, and next will be perhaps a little bit optimistic to 4 or 5 years. So the blurring lines of these two technologies, if you wish, one from a communication perspective and one from a cloud perspective, it's very, very important. And the ability of 5G to take advantage of all the benefits of what has been done by cloud infrastructure providers, I think it's paramount for us to move forward. Now, having talked about standards, I would like to mention that another point that I think is very important, and actually John mentioned that, it's the fact that the ecosystem involved in building 5G networks, whether they are public or private, it's really a new one, and it's of utmost importance to foster this environment that will allow the participation in the ecosystem to grow and enable the benefits promised by 5G and further by 6G. And therefore, I go back to, again, things that have been mentioned, the fact that research or, academia and the cooperation between different bodies should create more things like test beds, perhaps, and proof of concept that will allow all these participants in the ecosystem to prove their value within these different use cases that 5G and 6G enable. So, just to conclude on the Microsoft part, obviously we have a large amount of experts in standards and cloud and wireless. But as I said, I think the cloud interdependency with 5G will mean that all the players will have to participate and push forward to get the benefits of 5G and next G. Having said that, I would like to address the 6G. So about sometime last year, a new alliance has been created. It's called the Next G Alliance, and I'm very fortunate to be part of that. And I'm, alongside with many other companies which are, leaders in our world in terms of supplying different components, whether hardware or software. And Next G Alliance has been created really to push forward or to bring the North American leadership in Next G to the table, if you wish. There is always this concept of perhaps race to 5G or race to 6G. And I just want to say that, different parts of the world bring different things to the table. And the fact that, and maybe I'm being repetitive, but the fact that the cloud and the wireless networks are coming together, there is really no one is better than other. There are different things that are coming together to create this better environment for everybody, because this will have a trickle effect really once it started to get, we'll start to get the 5G and eventually 6G in terms of the benefits. And I think it's one more thing, if I might add, which is a little bit different, is the fact that 5G has a promise to do for the private networks what perhaps 4G did for consumers, right? So as again, John mentioned several times, 5G will enable industrial use cases that were not possible before. Therefore, bringing everything together, as I said, will have a tremendous effect on every country's GDP as the bottom line. So hopefully I have addressed the question.
Very well. Yes, very well so. I'd like to go back to something that Travis started with. Travis, you said that the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, actually set the requirements for 5G, and I think that was what they called the International Mobile Telecommunications 2020 specification. Do you all expect that the ITU will be setting the 2030 IMT, which will be 6G?
Yeah, I think we can see that unless something drastically happens within ITU. But yeah, I think we could continue seeing that that take place for 6G. Keep in mind that a few decades ago, so I'm going to age myself a little bit, all of our telecom standards came from the ITU. We didn't have a 3GPP, so I don't see them giving up their role there. I think they want to continue in being able to at least set the standards, even though they're not writing the specifications anymore.
Yeah,
And I would add like a interesting part to it is that we look at the KPIs, what are we shooting for in terms of the key performance indicators? And so we used to talk very classically in communications about, data rate, coverage, and then things quickly moved into reliability, latency, how fast you're doing things, security and resiliency, how secure is your network? How can you deploy it more cost effectively? So you get into some of these discussions of flexibility and number of supported connections, and even the ease of onboarding. So one of the exciting points is, as both Micaela and Travis was saying, as this kind of sphere of 5G is larger now, then more people are collaborating across specific industries, and at the same time, bringing some cohesive framework even into 3GPP. As an example, 5G AA for the Automobile Association, or ACIA, discussing some aspects on the industrial side. So as these other industries are saying, hey, I want to be able to have my workforce benefit from 5G. I want someone who's fixing that turbine to be wearing a 5G connected AR, like augmented or virtual reality headset, maybe 3-4 years from now. And so I want that 5G connected factory. How can I make sure my requirements are being understood? So there's always this iteration between the technology teams about what is possible, and then the broader target goals from IMT about, hey, these are the KPIs that really define the specification, and let's ensure that the output of the standard can meet those new requirements. And so this kind of key takeaway there is that there's that iterative part. We really look holistically at what's on an evolutionary track, like silicon processing, RF processing, we can do faster, better, shorter times, but then also what's on a more disruptive path. And I would absolutely agree, as Micaela is saying, that the cloud compute paradigm changed how 5G is getting deployed and orchestrated. And similarly, as we move into the 6G vector, there's going to be other things that are happening outside of strict telecom space, but are going to be relevant to 6G's deployment. And so the interesting thing then is, in terms of the requirements for defining 6G, it's an iterative process between use cases, achievability, state of technology in traditional areas, state of compute, state of distributed compute. So it's kind of an interesting, large, multifaceted challenge. And that's one of the reasons it's important to start early, so you can start massaging this huge amount of information and make sure the output is cohesive and is also coming in the right, steps, the right ordering of the steps, so there's commercial interest in those deployments, right? So 5G, we needed to make sure that mobile broadband happened first, because that was driving the foundational investments in those new deployments and those advanced, 5G and 4G networks. At the same time, that expansion we're still on going into new use cases is playing out across these multiple releases and these other kind of industry ecosystems.
May I just, sorry, I just want to add one thing that absolutely agreed with John. I would just add that things like sustainability are also coming into development of next G and standards, because as KPIs, we have all kinds of KPIs, but not necessarily sustainability KPIs. So these are all part and part, as I mentioned before, part of, and what John said, of the iterative process, but also the add-on of things that we have not thought before.
One thing I'd add there, by the way, because we keep alluding to it, but we haven't said it. 5G requirements solve IoT problems. Not a whole lot in there for a smartphone. The things that we solved, low latency, more battery life, all of those things were problems that we were having with IoT devices. So I think as we look forward into 6G and 7G, we're going to see a lot more around IoT things rather than our smartphones, and how do we as humans communicate together. It's going to be more and more of how do things communicate with things.
And so many more can be connected in even the same geographic space of the networks. John, you described kind of that waltz that goes on between the different standards bodies. I think it's just important for the viewers to understand there's these ones that are government treaty based, that is like the ITU, and there's many more that are private sector sort of self-generated. The other one, the 3GPP ones that Travis enumerated earlier, and these newer ones as well, and they're all kind of working together to develop the standards for next generation technology. One thing I want to talk about was the reasons we may not want standards in some areas, or why there may not need to be standards. There's, of course, standards benefit us in the sense they improve interoperability, they make predictability, they can help reduce costs because there's a common understood component or way of doing something. But when you look at the offerings of beyond 5G and these many use cases, many of them will be on private networks or enterprise networks. Some people call campuses for hospitals, for manufacturing and educational institutions. As innovative companies go to develop those applications, does everything they develop need to be standardized, or is there room for development and then might be standardized, may not be down the road? How should we think about that?
I would say there's always a mixture for both. There's something where we look at, as you said, the standardization brings scale, predictability, and ability to kind of agree on a common basis for something, right? You want to make sure you have your devices able to communicate with the infrastructure and across a much larger number of devices. At the same time, when we look longer term, we talk of the physical world where the number of devices is growing. We talk of the digital world where the data that they're exchanging is being digitized, and there's more and more information, as Travis was saying, on the IoT side. So it's not just about, we're not doing 6G so people can watch even more streaming video. They can do streaming video very effectively now. The thing is, as we look forward, there's going to be a lot more information exchange. The network is going to be more data-driven, more self-adaptive. These devices are going to be more fine-tuned. And at the same time, things are being virtualized in terms of the human-computer interface. So we went from the 4G smartphone into the 5G smartphone. We got improved performance, higher data rates, a lot of benefits. At the same time, another very exciting thing is, where is the computing interface going? So the way people interact with data and how that's changing, and that's playing out as we speak in the 5G augmented virtual reality space. But when we look longer term towards 6G in 2030, that merging of these physical, digital, and virtual worlds also creates foundational new opportunities. So you're putting together a broader set of things. And so there's a huge amount of scope for innovative products that are doing things differently than other products, innovative applications. When you're looking, how can I make a nurse practitioner more effective in her job? How can I get that right information for her? How can I make a teacher more effective in terms of engagement with the classmates, or make sure the students are getting the right information at the right time? And so there's a lot of room for innovation, beyond the standardization side when it comes, and as Micaela said as well, the role of green networks and having power efficiency and some of these goals on sustainability are also important. So when we look globally at all of these technologies, then this ability to have innovation that leverages a solid, overall standardization framework, I think that's the right way to get the best of both worlds.
Sorry.
I was just going to mention very quickly, you might comment on this, is I noticed that just in the submission that Addis Next G Alliance made to the ITU on the Vision 2030, it mentions sustainability as one KPI, and the other being artificial intelligence to enable efficiency, spectrum management. So that's just, I think,
those are very important goals. We have some audacious goals in Next G Alliance. I just wanted to go back to something that John said, which I think, and you mentioned, I think it's very important. In my mind, I have this visual, standards. It's sort of allowing A to communicate with B, right? Or to have this transparent interaction where the ecosystem perhaps and the innovation, it's sort of on a vertical, if you wish. It's open APIs and transparent, open interfaces. Really, that's what it boils down to. And having the ability to participate and open up more and more this horizontal that was previously a little bit more rigid than what it is becoming today. It will allow indeed for all this innovation that John was talking about in terms of anything from augmented reality to whatever non-terrestrial networks.
Travis, do you want anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're going to see some niche markets as well, right? I mean, certainly in areas like defense, we see that already, where you might have a tactical network that's going to be part standards based, but then it's not going to be able to be standards based 100% because there's things that are purpose built and specialized. So I think there's a real market there on the network side around specialized capabilities. But a lot of the innovation gets back to what John was saying, the applications. Where is it that we're trying to connect to? These devices are not just connecting to a network. They're connecting to an application someplace to share their data. And I see that really is the next big explosion. We saw it in 4G to some extent, where, well, to a lot actually, we saw in 4G where all of a sudden we had all of these application stores and just tons and tons of applications for a smartphone. Now I think we see where we're collecting a lot of different types of data from things, and that data needs to go to an application someplace. And typically that application is sitting in the cloud. So I see a lot of work that's going to get done here over the next couple of years around those applications. I see that really being the place for innovation.
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting because in my visual as well, you had these applications that came on the end device with 4G. And now with 5G, as mentioned before, opening the RAN, for instance, now you're going to be able to insert an application in different parts of the network, which previously was not necessarily possible, and create more, monetize the network as well as create more efficiencies and become more sustainable and all these good things.
And I would say, like, what's another interesting part, we often think, that, hey, 5G, 6G is just about communications, right? And so one of the points we made was that actually it's also about computing, right? I think Micaela made that point very well, and this role then of how computing plays into things. And I think another thing to pay attention to, the role of sensing, even better understanding your environment. And so that's going to be relevant for some of these future applications, whether it's an augmented reality setup where you're enabling, for example, a more immersive physical experience for entertainment, or whether you're enabling a more robust collaboration with colleagues or more robust training settings where there's a huge amount of people benefiting from that digital twin of the physical world. So the ability for these new frequency bands we're using and new designs, leveraging that role of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So you have the data, as Travis was saying, is getting generated at the edge of the network. And then we're processing some of that data locally at the edge of the network, because we're not just going to push everything back to the cloud without having some form of inference and processing at the edge. But then how do we combine that into the role of sensing? And even how does sensing relate to some of these future applications? So I think there's that kind of integrated communications and sensing side that becomes very interesting as well. So as we're designing new 6G waveforms, we're keeping that in mind as well, that some of the applications are not just about moving bits between devices and the network.
Very important point for accessibility and smart cities and other applications that will definitely make our life much easier and much better.
I wanted to spend the next few minutes pivoting a little bit more to the public policy side of standards. People reading the papers have noticed there have been times where there's been statements about the amount of participation standards bodies focused on the nationality of the participants or the country where that company is headquartered. And there's been statements about the number of patents relevant to, say, 5G or 6G. I believe Jim highlighted the number that China has attested to in his discussion paper for this event. Maybe start with you, Travis. Could you talk a little bit about why those measures aren't really accurate and not good ways to assess a nation's contributions and overall technological leadership in an area like 5G or 6G?
It really gets down to the significance of the contribution. And I always point back to look at the major tech that makes up a 5G network today. it's HTTP, which is Western origin. It's TCP/IP. It's all of these technologies that came out of Western countries. And when we start to look at pure volume of contributions, and by the way, I get a couple of hundred emails a day from 3GPP on contributions, and so as I go through those, that's my first measurement: is how significant is this contribution? Okay, we forgot to dot an I and cross a T. That's still a contribution, and that gets measured as a contribution in the 3GPP metrics. So it's a really, really poor metric to go by strictly just contributions. You got to look at the relevance, and you have to look at whether or not the contribution was even accepted as a part of the standard or not. And sadly, within 3GPP, there just is no way to be able to measure that unless you're reading all of the contributions directly.
John or Micaela, anything to add?
I would say one of the things, as Travis mentioned, one of the things we focus on is that foundational nature, right? So that we're designing something that's actually going to move the needle, and it's also going to get deployed. It's going to be put into practice. And so when we look at that, getting the timing right, that's kind of important, because the goal here is not to write a piece of paper and say, hey, this is the standard. Hey, let's all celebrate and come back together 10 years later. The goal is actually, it's a living and breathing, evolving document that represents many different working groups, many different technologies. And it's about how does that map to opening up these new use cases so that the technology gets deployed into people's hands, into these new applications. So whereas look at the value of the innovation and what's it doing in terms of improving the overall capabilities of the network. And absolutely, we need to make sure that the standard is consistent and that things are done carefully. At the same time, contributions that are really representing that foundational innovation are much more higher value to the ecosystem.
And I would like to add to that. So, clearly there are discussions, perhaps relevant or not, about the number of contributions by different region or player in 3GPP. But if you look at all the other aspects of technologies coming together in 6G, as mentioned, we mentioned cloud, but there is also, as I mentioned before, non-terrestrial communications. Those investments and that research and that really leadership in these technologies, it's coming from, I want to say, US, because that is the case. And so it's not necessarily anymore a race to who has more patents. It's more of a let's develop everything as much as possible. They are all equally important, and bring them together in a fashion that will create a better industry and better revenue for everybody involved, as well as positive effects from a societal perspective.
And I think one of the interesting points, as Micaela raises, on like the NTN, right, non-terrestrial network. So the ability to leverage that core 5G communications link and say, well, how can we better connect more devices across more use cases? So whether we're connecting the unconnected, making sure 5G is not only deployed in urban markets, but also it's getting deployed in rural markets. So how can we extend the coverage? So doing very specific work, for example, on higher power transmit, CPEs, or these fixed wireless access terminals, that can really help extend the distance or the range, from 1 kilometer to 3 kilometers or 5 kilometers. All of a sudden that starts making a measurable distance to who can be connected and the sort of data they can exchange. At the same time, whether we're connecting base stations to each other or devices to each other, for example, like V2V, vehicle to vehicle, we're leveraging that core capability of 5G, but in release 16, we added some unique aspects to vehicle communication. And then we bring in smart transportation, smart city, say, well, let's have a smart roadside unit that's tied to the traffic light that can better communicate with the vehicles using this, side link communication channel. And so it's a lot about putting pieces together. So whether it's connecting satellites, reusing the core capabilities of 5G, or connecting other things terrestrially to ensure, basically a tighter leverage from those investments. And I think it kind of, to double back to that private public part, not only is it important to really be collaborating with academia and collaborating with government, but then also looking at, well, how do these different use cases make sense for a smart city? And a lot of those discussions that are happening are more on the ecosystem side. well, how is the technology going to be used? Who's making the investment? What's the right public-private partnership model to ensure things actually get deployed? And so there's a lot of interesting policy discussions to go hand in hand with the technical feasibility of the overall system.
Also, that brings up another good point too, in that, we always look at 5G as the next evolution of cellular. It really doesn't care if you're connecting by cellular or Wi-Fi or even fixed line or fiber optics. So 5G is really access agnostic. And in fact, you can look at the Broadband Forum and some work that the Broadband Forum is doing right now, where they're actually using a 5G core network and its capabilities for managing broadband networks that are non-cellular. So I think, we got to be thinking about that as well, because for the first time, we're talking about technology that is not specific to cellular. It addresses a whole bunch of different types of access types and technologies.
Jim, I think you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple if it's okay, because 5G and 6G made a brief appearance in the first results of the Trade and Technology Council with the EU from Pittsburgh. So maybe a good first question would be, what should the US invest in? Where would you want to see us spend money? Rob started with public policy, and we might actually turn the taps on at some point here. Where should we be spending for 6G?
I personally think what's really important across, if we look at United States and Europe as an example, what's really important is that long-term investment in the core technologies, right? So whether it's semiconductor, whether it's some of these wireless research, we have to make sure that the long-term hard work is still happening, that there's still graduate students being produced, there's still undergraduates being produced with a wide set of skills. And so because of that, those investments, and when does it need to be complementary versus when is it aligned, making sure that there's not just pure duplication. Some of the duplication is good because you're taking creative different approaches to an overall problem, but at the same time, big areas like quantum, security, all of those things that are identified, I think the important part is getting that model right so that there's that, interesting exchange of ideas. I have a research team in the United States. I also have one in Europe, and they collaborate on a daily basis on different technology topics. And some of the markets are experiencing, different inputs in Europe in terms of, different ecosystems, whether it's automotive or industrial. And so the reality of that global part means even when we look at that long-term research and even that government funding of the National Science Foundation or other government labs, we have to do that in a more strategic way, recognizing this technology is going to be out there for a long time. And it's also going to evolve and have a life of its own after it gets deployed. And so kind of making sure that those investments have the right time horizon and then also have the right, level of alignment, with our other countries. I think it's really important at this stage.
I do want. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Trav. Okay, thank you. I just want to add something that I think is very important, and it was on my list to make sure we address. But security is one of the aspects that will be constant and ongoing investment, if you wish. And I think security is one of those things that are very important relative to standards, right? So you do want the governments to adopt international standards for the harmonization of this communication, and again, for the benefit of everyone, as opposed to going back to what Travis was mentioning, having standards specific to one region or one country, which will make commercialization and globalization much harder for players in the industry. So there is, going back to policy investment and how these things go hand in hand. There is a desire for the for standards to be, really embraced and perhaps augmented as deemed necessarily. But definitely the policy is to have this harmonization as opposed to different silos of security, which will not allow us to, not us, but generally the industry to play in that.
Education really plays a huge role here. I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
Especially in security. I mean, the last report that I looked at a few months back, we've got over 4,000 security positions unfilled globally because there's not enough qualified candidates to fulfill those positions. And as we move to 6G and 7G and into this new type of a cloud architecture, security is so paramount. And especially given the climate that we're seeing today, where it's ransomware of the hour. I mean, you're in trouble when there's ransomware as a service or hacking as a service. We're in for quite a decade ahead of us, but yet we don't have the professionals with the skill sets that they need to be able to address those issues. And that starts with education. And that education doesn't start in the colleges and universities. It starts in K through 12. And so we really need a strong focus and investment in K through 12 for the sciences, the STEM, because that's what's going to be required going forward.
Can I do another one, Rob?
Go ahead.
Thanks. And I don't know if you were surprised, Rob, but when you look at the Pittsburgh document, the joint statement, working group 1, the very first working group, is technology standards. That's probably a first for any international alignment, but maybe focusing in a bit more on that, since it's clearly important to the EU and the US, what would you tell them in terms of advice for how government should get involved in the standards process? What government can do to support the standards process? So what are the specifics you might want to lay out?
I mean, I would say a couple of things are that what's important is that the decisions are based on the technical merit, right? That there is this aspect of, we don't need a whole bunch of government agents, attending every standards meeting. We need the industry to be able to do its job, to focus on getting those things right from a technology standpoint and a commercial readiness standpoint. At the same time, as discussed, we really need to ensure that the supply side of the educated talent is available for industry and even small companies, large companies, medium-sized companies. There's a lot more players, as we've discussed, participating both in the standardization side and in the technology side. And so making sure that you have that talent being created, that's one of the most important roles of government. And at the same time, enabling industries to have these, standards bodies not become biased, make sure that their output is technically minded and that the decision processes are respected.
I've said this many times. When you look at participating in the standards, the barrier is not the entrance fees into the standards bodies. It requires a full-time headcount dedicated to standards. I mentioned, I get a few hundred emails a day from 3GPP. I obviously do not read them, not all of them, because there's just no time in the day if you've got other responsibilities. And so the people that we have in the organization that are standards focused, that is all they do. They are standards 100%, because it requires that level of dedication and commitment. And I would say too, it's also in the expenses. Now, fortunately, during COVID, we're not doing face-to-face meetings. Prior to COVID, you were on a boondoggle, I'm in a business trip, usually every month, right? The country of the hour was where the next meeting was going to be held. And that gets rather expensive. I think we're going to start to see more and more telecommuting or remote meetings, Zoom sessions. I think we're going to see that spirit carry forward, hopefully, but it still represents an expense. You got to have headcount and you got to have those resources that are committed and dedicated for more than just a few months. It's years worth of work. So government can help in softening that impact. That helps bring in small and medium business.
Yeah, and just Jim, following up on your point, the first working groups, the statement associated with that said that they would seek to meet the WTO's standards for technical barriers to trade agreement, which is open, transparent, consensus-based technical standards policy making. And the Quad also had a similar strong statement from the leaders talking about, especially with respect to telecom, open and standards-based, and then they also go on to talk about the same features of other technical standards bodies. So I think there's a great understanding by policymakers about what should be done with regard to private sector bodies. But I think finding productive ideas on funding and in ways that perhaps government can help small businesses participate in these bodies, if that's an issue, are important. We're running to roughly our last 5 minutes here. Unless anyone had anything they were burning to raise, otherwise I was going to turn back to security again and just ask, how is, there's been a lot of discussion about security for all these emerging technologies because it is so important to our daily lives and really important for all kinds of industrial applications. How is security incorporated into the 5G standards process and other standards processes? And are there any things that we should be attuned to in the years to come?
Yeah, so there is a working group committed to security within 3GPP. That's the SA3. And this set of releases, they actually took into account the mistakes of the past. So a lot of the things that we saw that were missing in 3G and 4G have been put into place within 5G. However, that only addresses things up at the application layer within 5G, the connectivity and the authorization and authentication mechanisms. That doesn't take into account some of the lower layer issues. So again, we're putting this onto a cloud infrastructure. So now you got to start looking at cloud security. You have to look at container security. And there's been a lot of back and forth about, what's the vulnerability of containers versus VNFs, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll put it this way. What we found in previous releases in all of these vulnerabilities that we talked about, location tracking, all that stuff, it wasn't necessarily the technology that was at fault. It was how it was implemented. It was, not having the right firewalls put into place or not putting certain things into place. That's going to be really, really important in 5G and 6G and 7G. You have to put the right protections into place, and you have to implement all of the tools that come in the toolbox. Virtualization offers a lot of different tools for security if you implement them. If you don't implement them, you're going to have a mess.
And I think it's also important at this early stage, even engaging with academia on the longer term, research on data security and privacy, or identity device management, authentication, right? There's so many different subsets of security that it's important to take kind of a secure by design end-to-end view. So the data, that's going into a private factory is very sensitive. So are you looking at, as Travis is saying, the implementation side, the standardization side, and that end-to-end performance point that you've actually, have it deployed correctly so that you're understanding and predicting those attack vectors. And so as the kind of expanding surface area of 5G is getting larger and 6G is going to be similarly be very large, it's important to kind of understand better where are these attacks coming from? How can we be more secure by design in our approach? And then also leverage the most powerful tool chains. We have to be thinking to make sure we're secure for a post-quantum era, right? So how are we building that into how we look at these, future network architectures? Things are more distributed. So what does that mean in terms of the information flow and exchange? So I do think there's many different topics to security that necessitate a broad long-term view.
And just to add to that, I think all has been said, but just to add a little bit more emphasis on it, the integration of the cloud security standards and capabilities, as well as the type of access to security telemetry to detect threats, for instance, which is available and now will be accessible by 5G and XG networks. Things like firmware resiliency from data centers to the far edge, those are all things that have been worked and will contribute to furthering the security of networks for the next generations.
You can also look to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Exactly.
They have a number of really excellent guidelines and best practices for securing a virtual network that I think every service provider needs to take a long, hard look at.
And I'd say and it also goes all the way to supply chain and secure root of trust, right? So we're able to embed in Qualcomm silicon that secure root of trust. So if we're looking at attestation or these other things, you really know it's the device. That the network has an understanding that, yes, that is the one. And so that kind of goes all the way into the silicon side, all the way to the cloud, as Travis and Micaela said. So it's that end-to-end view of making sure each of those things is done well.
Great. Well, I think we're almost come to the end of our hour. You guys have just been an outstanding panel unpacking some really complicated concepts and topics within standardization. You've done a wonderful job doing that. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And Jim, thanks so much for organizing this, and turn it back to you, Jim, for any final thoughts.
Great, thanks, Rob. No, this was a great discussion. So I'm not going to try and summarize it because there was too much, but I think some of the themes that were interesting were that the next generations of telecom are going to do for the economy what 4G did for consumers. That's a valuable point. The discussion of security, it's not getting better, right? Sustainability, I mean, that's kind of a new topic for us, and I think it's an important one. Performance and thinking about performance and maybe a broader range of metrics. And finally, the point you all made, which is the 5G, 6G, it's more about things than people, right? It's more about connecting a whole range of new devices. And Rob, I think you put it well when you were talking about the Internet of Things. So a very rich discussion. Thank you all for participating, and thanks for everyone for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.